Hey everyone, it's Miss Lopez. Welcome to our first of a three-part series where we look at Unit 8 Ecology throughout the school year. In this first part, we'll be looking at ecological communities, ecological diversity, and ecological disturbances. So we're going to be able to describe ecological communities, explain how they change in their physical space and over time, how the structure of the community affects its function, and how diversity is going to provide a clue as to how a community will function or how long will it be what we call stable. So let's start at the beginning. Defining what a community is. So a community is a group of species that occur together in a geographic area. So if you want to think of this as a hierarchy system, you can start at the organism, so an individual. Then when you have a group of the same species living in a similar area, so for example, there's a group of grasshoppers here. I think those are grasshoppers. That is what's known as a population. When you have several populations interacting together, you form what's called the community. So the community might be the wildebeest and zebras and plants that live in a specific area of Africa. Or it might be the mockingbirds that live in a series of mesquite trees interacting with other native birds. So they're all groups of living organisms that are interacting together. Now, when we look at these different communities, we can characterize them by composition, which is which species they contain, so the names of the species themselves. Species richness, which is simply the number of species. So there are 10 species living in this area, or there are 3 species living in this area. Species evenness is the abundance of each species. So do you have an equal number of each species, or do you have, for example, 1 or 2 of one species and then 5,000 of another? And all of these components contribute to what we call a community structure, many times what's known as the diversity of the community. So let's put this into practice. We're going to look at 3 different communities, and we're going to compare them in terms of the components. So we're looking at communities of mushrooms, and each of the different drawing or image represents a different species. So we can compare community A to B to C in terms of the components we just talked about. But we're going to focus on richness and evenness. So let's start with richness. Now remember that the richness is simply the number of species in each community. So in other words, it would be the number of different mushrooms in our diagrams here. So we have 1, 2, 3. In community A, we have 3 different species. In community B, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 species. And in community C, we also have 1, 2, 3, 4 different species. So based on what we know so far, we would say that community A has the lowest richness, which is just simply the number of species. Now, all of these communities have 12 individuals in the community. But we want to compare community A to community B. Based on the richness, community B is more diverse, simply because it's got more species than community A. However, richness alone is not the only component of diversity. Take a look at community C here. Community C does have 4 different species. But when you look at the evenness, in other words, how many of each, you'll notice that in community C, it's basically almost all made up of the yellow mushrooms. So although richness may be higher in one community compared to another, doesn't necessarily mean that the diversity is higher in this one. In fact, the diversity is lower in this one because of the evenness, or how many of each species. So it's important to remember that diversity is not based simply on the number of species, but it also has to incorporate how much or how many of each species there is in the community. So why is diversity important? We are going to look at diversity and how a high diversity is beneficial to a community. So let's take a look at diversity, and we're going to look at it as a function of what we call the stability of the ecosystem. In other words, if there's any change, let's say a flood comes in or a new disease is starting to spread, then we look at how likely is that ecological community to survive the changes based on its diversity. So we are going to look at diversity versus stability. And keep in mind that as we go up along this y-axis, we're saying that stability is increasing. And diversity, as we go along the x-axis, we're saying diversity increases. So here's the relationship. As diversity increases for a community, the stability of that community will also increase. I believe in math you call these positive correlations. So your graph would look like this. You could also say that the opposite would be true. If diversity is to decrease for whatever reason, then the stability of that ecosystem would also decrease. It's important to note that richness is going to vary on islands, much different than it would on the mainland. And usually what happens is on the mainland, you have much more richness, therefore more biodiversity typically on the mainland. But as you get to islands that are further off the coast, the more organisms are going to be able to make that journey. So for example, here, maybe some mammals might be able to cross the ocean or the little water barrier here, and birds might have an easier time of getting across. But the further you are away from the mainland, the less number of species are going to be able to travel there. And so this is what's called island biodiversity. So what you see on these islands may have much less biodiversity than the mainland. So species compositions change over time. All communities are dynamic, meaning that they change. There's always ongoing colonization and local extinctions, and thus what we call a steady turnover in species composition. Dispersal also helps. Dispersal is just organisms moving in and out. So it kind of creates this constant change to the number of individuals to ecosystems in most cases. Isolated locations such as the island biodiversity we just talked about would be not as subject to this influx or migration of organisms in and out. But these species are always going to be changing because these communities will always be changing because one species might have a boom in their year and another species might be, more prone to extinction. And then the following year, it may flip. So anytime there's a change to a local ecosystem, we call it a disturbance. Disturbances are anything that can cause species to be suddenly limited in their resources, and so it causes a change in the makeup of the community. Sometimes some species are wiped out, sometimes all species are wiped out. Sometimes the environmental conditions are changed completely. But whenever we look at disturbances, we can kind of predict how the community will bounce back. And that structured way that the community comes back is very predictable and is called succession. So again, succession is the change in the ecosystem, and there's two types of succession. You have primary succession and secondary succession. So primary succession begins with no life whatsoever. There's no soil that's going to be present. This is usually in the case of like a volcano has covered the entire area with lava. The lava cools into rock, or maybe a glacier has melted away and exposed the rock underneath. Secondary succession is just the removing of the biotic part of the environment. The soil remains intact. So, for example, following a fire, or a farmer clears out an area to plant crops, but then decides not to plant crops. So the important thing is that soil is still present. So just remember S for soil, S for secondary. And in primary succession, there's no soil. This is the most important thing to remember. And so as a result of the soil being present or absent, the biomass is going to be able to bounce back quicker than in secondary succession than in primary, because the first thing that's going to happen is the lichen and moss, which are called pioneer species, have to begin by making new soil. Once new soil is present, plants can come in, and then so it's going to be small plants to begin with, and then they can make way for larger plants and eventually animals. Whereas in secondary succession, the biomass is going to happen or accumulate much faster. Seeds are already present, roots are already present, the soil is already there. All right, so let's compare primary to secondary succession. And we're going to look at these in both in terms of time and the changes that occur. So on both of these, the amount or relative amount is going to be our y-axis. This could be in grams, in kilograms, in any unit that you want. It's just kind of a relative amount, knowing that going up the y-axis means that it's increasing. So let's start with primary succession. And let's start with the amount of soil. So in primary succession, there's no soil present, meaning that the amount of soil for a long time at the beginning of this, after the disturbance, let's say the volcano erupted here, for a long time, there's going to be no soil present. That takes a long time. So our graph might look something like this. Showing that the amount stays relatively low and then increases over time. However, in secondary succession, remember that soil is not affected. So the amount of soil that happens at, let's say, the fire happens here, over time, the amount of soil actually doesn't change much. Because in secondary succession, the soil is unaffected. Now let's take a look at how this would occur, or how this would affect the amount of biomass present. Biomass would be plants and animals. And in primary succession, again, we don't have soil present, so the amount of biomass is going to stay very, very low, and it won't start accumulating until after the soil begins to build up. So it would probably look something like this. Whereas in secondary succession, the biomass may start relatively low, but there's still seeds and roots below the soil, and so the amount will never be as low as it was in primary succession, and the amount of biomass accumulates very rapidly. Now, in these communities, each species has a unique niche that determines its function in the community. The concept of the niche has two meanings. It's the the environmental niche is where we would expect to find the species based on its tolerance to the abiotic factors. In other words, is it adapted to a desert environment, or is it adapted to a jungle environment? The second one is the biological environment, or the biological niche, and talks about the importance of how does it interact with the biotic components of the environment. So is it a predator or is it prey? What are some of its competitors? When does it mate? How long does it live? Everything about that describes that organism is what we identify as a niche. So many times students want to say that the niche is the job that an organism has in its environment. Please do not use that. That is not enough information for what a niche is. You can use that to help you remember, but then you have to get into details about what you mean by the job that it has. We're talking about the abiotic conditions and the biotic conditions that this organism has. All right, so the last thing we're going to do is go through the types of interactions, and we're going to go through these very quickly because many of these you have probably seen before in Biology 1. So for each of these interactions, we're going to talk about what it is, how it affects species 1, how it affects species 2, and then some important things to remember. So the first one we're going to do is competition. So with competition, both organisms, species 1 and species 2, are negatively affected. We can classify competition based on two types, either interspecific. Notice the E right here. This is between individuals of different species. So what you're looking at in this diagram is you have some deer, you have some zebra, some wildebeest, and they're all fighting for this limited resource, which is the water. So because different species are competing for a resource, that is what's called interspecific. So different species are interspecific, and they're all competing for the same resource. And the fact that they have to share this resource negatively affects them, because if it was just the zebras, they wouldn't have to share with anyone. They'd have the water all to themselves. But the reality is they do have to interact with other organisms. And so each organism now gets less than if it was just that one species. Now, sometimes we also look at intraspecific, because this is another important type of competition. With intraspecific, it's looking at the same species. So for example, I'm going to randomly select this zebra right here may be a male and has to compete with this other zebra over here for females to mate with. So intraspecific competition is competition within the same species. And it may be for water, food, mates, but it's within the same species. Now, what some of these organisms can do is what's known as resource partitioning. So this is where, think of it as sharing. It's different ways of using a resource that can be used to make sure that all organisms survive. So in this example, they're showing you that these different species of bird are all competing for this same tree. So they're different species, that makes it interspecific. But as you can see here, these birds are only going to use different parts of the tree. So because they use different parts of the tree, they can all coexist on this one tree. That's what we call resource partitioning. So let's take a look at an example of resource partitioning. We're looking at two species that eats two different types of seeds. Now, species A eats seeds that are relatively smaller in size compared to species B. And you can see here that both of them can eat the medium-sized seeds. But because they also can eat seeds of other varieties, They don't drive each other to extinction. So this resource partitioning is very important because if they can share, then each species has a chance of surviving. If we introduce a new species, let's say another type of bird that eats seeds in this range right here, well, that would be troublesome for species A because they will begin to lose on food. So they're either going to have to depend more on these medium-sized ones, or they're going to go extinct. The introduction of the new species wouldn't necessarily or directly affect species B, but if species A started eating more of these ones, then that could affect species B. As I mentioned, that introduction of a new species is what's known as an invasive species, and they have very negative effect on native species. This is a classic example. This is what's called a lionfish, and it was introduced into the Caribbean thanks to a hurricane that hit Florida. So many people keep these fish in tanks because they're very beautiful fish to look at. But after a hurricane, some of these fish escaped into the Caribbean, and now they are what is known as an invasive species. They are killing and eating all the other fish in the Caribbean, and it's a real big problem. This slide shows another example of an invasive species. This is what's known as kudzu, and it takes over in the southeast. It's a vine that grows over everything. These invasive species can harm native species in many ways. They can take away some kind of limited resource such as sunlight, water, food, or just simply space to live. Sometimes, as in the case of the lionfish, it produces a toxin. And sometimes, as in the case of the lionfish, the introduced species are aggressive predators. And so they will wipe out other organisms that don't have defenses against them. And many times, these invasive species don't have any predators to keep them under control. So that was competition. Now looking at these consumer resource interactions. So these would be things like predation, parasitism, herbivory, which is where your herbivores eat plants. In this case, this is a positive negative relationship. So one species will benefit, the other one will be harmed. And in the case of these consumer resource interactions, it leads to what's called an evolutionary arms race, in which the prey continually try to evolve better defenses, skills, something to get away from predators. And predators are continuously also evolving ways to keep up with the prey that they need to eat. So what are some of the ways that these prey organisms can fight back? They can either use speed, size, or weapons to thwart their predators. And many times, such as the case of this butterfly right here, this is what's called aposematic coloration. Aposematic coloration is bright to warn predators, don't eat me. So think of skunks, think of snakes, or think of poison dart frogs that are brightly colored. That is aposematic coloration. Sometimes they use camouflage, which is called cryptic coloration. For example, there is a chameleon right here that looks like the dead leaves that are around it. So that's called cryptic coloration. Sometimes what organisms do is they mimic unpalpable species. So this is what's known as Batesian mimicry. So this butterfly right here is actually harmless, but it looks like the harmful version so that birds kind of know like, oh, last time I ate something like this, I got super sick. I'm not going to eat anything that has that same coloration. So that's the Batesian coloration. And then sometimes the dangerous versions can look like other dangerous versions. And that's what's known as Mullerian mimicry. So when you think of like a bee, the coloration of a bee, and the coloration of a wasp, they're very, very similar. Sometimes they'll have thick armor or non-nutritive or poisonous or are poisonous. And so they advertise these poisons with that aposematic coloration. And it's not just animals that have the ability to fight back. Plants produce a variety of toxic chemicals against herbivores and pathogens. So something like nicotine is actually very, very toxic and deadly, and is intended to keep animals from eating the leaves. Some plants will use other chemicals that we actually like the taste of. So like spices, black pepper, chili peppers, caffeine. Herbivores will evolve different ways to deal with the chemicals as well. So sometimes they're immune. For example, birds do not feel the heat from peppers. The next type of interaction is mutualism. This is where both species are going to benefit. So you can think of like the bee getting the nectar from the flower. The bee benefits because it's eating the nectar, but the flower is benefiting because the bee is getting the pollen on it and transporting that to another plant for pollination. And then the last one is commensalism. So this is where one organism benefits and the other is unaffected. Good example of this would be birds that hang around cows and other livestock. So as the cows are walking through the tall grass, it exposes insects, and the birds benefit by being able to easily spot and eat the insects, but the cows and livestock are completely unaffected. That's it for your ecology video. Thanks for watching. Bye.